guys, as promised, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the first couple of readings that we had for the semester. And I also wanted to touch on a little bit concerning some of the posts that I've seen so far. Some of you guys are spot on. Other folks are, I think, struggling a little bit with how to approach the discussion board assignments. So first I want to run through sort of each of the readings that we had for discussion board post 1. And they were the Iroquois creation story, the Navajo creation story, the trickster tale, and then the two letters from Columbus. One was the letter of discovery, and then the other one was the letter concerning the fourth voyage. So first, in terms of the Iroquois story, what we notice is that in terms of this tale, the world was born of two twins who were good and evil, roughly similar to something that we see in terms of the Garden of Eden in Judeo-Christian belief structures. However, these two parts, good and evil, are twins, which to me is really interesting to think about, as I mentioned in my prior video. And so I would like for you guys to think a little bit about why it is significant that we think about good and evil as twins. What do we know about twins, and why is it salient that they think about their world through this notion of twins? A woman is the originator, so it's from the maternalistic perspective, which is, again, very different from what we see in Judeo-Christian belief systems. So why is that important specifically to how they conceptualize their world? According to this tale, the good mind created all that we see that is good, and that the bad mind created all that we see as painful and what we ultimately suffer. In terms of the battle that happens at the end, the good mind ends up winning the battle, but remnants of the bad mind remain, namely things like death and other things that were listed that we see throughout our world. So what's interesting to me is how they try to grasp at why there are things in this world that are good, that things that make us happy, things that make us comfortable and protected and safe, and then why there are other things in this world that are perhaps uncomfortable, like death or suffering and pain. And so I want you to think about maybe why it was that they approached narrating the world in this way, and how it might help them to understand why there are some good things in the world and bad. In terms of the Navajo story, what we get is this meeting of the sky and the water. So to me, I'm wondering why sky and water are important in this story, what it is about sky and water that might articulate something powerful, or how it might be viewed, sky and water, as the separations of the different spheres. And so from the meeting of sky and water, we also have the holy people, who to them were the representation of beauty, almost in, or they were in a reflection of the gods or holy beings, which is interesting to me because we think in Judeo-Christian culture about human beings coming from original sin, whereas these people imagine themselves as representations of something beautiful. And so I'm curious to know what you guys think about in terms of starting from a place of beauty rather than a place of original sin. To them, all was good until the first group of people committed adultery, which is curious to me because first, it tells me that this story is coming from all the things that they have at their disposal in their lived experience. So bad things come from doing bad things. And so I'm curious to hear you guys talk a little bit about why it is that adultery might function in this story, or how it functions. And perhaps primarily it's a representation of what we shouldn't do. But perhaps it is also a way by which we can think about how bad things happen, or how the world is moved by perhaps the choices that human beings make. And so what's fascinating in terms of this creation story is there's not just one act of adultery, but there are multiple. And as most of you guys are likely going to go on to study more literature, perhaps, one of the key things that you need to remember is that whenever there is repetition, that repetition is important. So if we see a repetition of adultery throughout the Navajo creation story, my question to you is going to be, how do you think that particular act plays a role in these stories, and how does it communicate something in particular that the storytellers wanted to communicate? They also describe rituals, especially rituals that are tied to rituals that are still used in those Navajo traditions to the present day. And so I'm curious to hear you guys think about, um, or at least articulate, why those sort of beginning stories are so important in terms of. Not only ritual but history for a culture. So, why is it important that we know where we came from? Why is it important to have an understanding of why we have the rituals that we do today? The story continues with the fight between men and women, which I found particularly fascinating considering my background in gender and sexuality. There's even a really humorous insertion in the story about how when the two sexes were separated, that women went on to pleasure themselves in inappropriate ways, and that those types of pleasuring ultimately created monstrous subjects in the world, or introduced monstrous subjects to the world. And so I'm curious to hear you guys talk through, perhaps, why it is that they would decide to, number one, cast the women as the sort of aggressors in the story, and not just the aggressors, but the harbingers of monsters, and why women's sexuality in particular is something that needs to be policed. In the end, obviously they end up coming back and living in harmony, which gives us that kind of nice ending to the story, that once we all come back together, that is the way that we should be, that is how we should interact together. So, in a lot of ways, this is almost like an Aesop's fable, where we get the moral of the story. And we also have this fascinating little piece where Coyote tells us that, even though the rock floated and we should live forever, he makes the rock sink because he doesn't feel that we should live forever. So it sort of ends with the question of, even if we could live forever, should we and would we? So, a couple things to think about there. And then, in terms of the trickster tale that we have, I also thought that this story was really humorous, and a couple of you guys commented on that in the discussion board. Primarily, it's there to teach a lesson. The trickster is usually the dope of the tale, and clearly we see that with this particular trickster. He thinks that he's getting one over on everyone by eating the bulb, and clearly, what is portended to happen to him happens. And so I'm curious to hear you guys talk a little bit about whether or not you feel that this is in line with some of the other trickster tales that we have in American literature, primarily trickster tales like Brer Rabbit, and how perhaps they are similar or different. I also was curious again about some of the repetition, primarily at the end of the story where he goes to the different trees to attempt to find his way to purification. And that purification happens, or that safety happens, with the tree that is closest to the water. And so we have water almost throughout all three of these stories in Native American tradition. And so I want you to think about why water is important here, and perhaps how water symbolically functions throughout all of these separate tales.